Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us this launch seminar of the book, Forced Migration and Humanitarian Action, Operational Challenges and Solutions for Supporting People on the Move. My name is Akomoto, specially appointed research fellow of the JICA Ogata Research Institute. I will be your moderator in today's seminar. Before we begin the seminar, we would like to share some housekeeping reminders. First, today's book launch seminar is conducted in a hybrid format of in-person and online via Zoom. Second, we have allotted the time for Q&A after the final presentation. If you are attending in person, please raise your hand and we will have a microphone available. If you are attending online, please click the Q&A icon on Zoom, type in your question, and send it to us. Please note that we will not be using the chat box or the raise your hand function. You can raise questions either in English or Japanese. Lastly, we would like to remind everyone that this seminar will be recorded via Zoom, and the video recording will be posted on our Research Institute website later. Let's now begin the seminar. In this seminar, the editors and authors of the recently published book entitled Forced Migration and Humanitarian Action, Operational Challenges and Solutions for Supporting People on the Move will present the key findings from the book. With a discussion of forced migration and humanitarian action at its core, we believe that the seminar is a great opportunity to consider the challenges and pathway for supporting displaced people. The presentations will be followed by input from the distinguished commentator and conclude with a Q&A session with the floor. To welcome to this event, we'd like to call Dr. Tomomi Orita, Principal Research Fellow of the JICA Ogata Research Institute, to give the opening remarks. Dr. Orita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muto. Okay, distinguished panelists and honorable participants, thank you very much for attending today's seminar to launch the book, Forced Migration and Humanitarian Action, Operational Challenges and Solutions for Supporting People on the Move. Forced migration is a growing international concern today. UNHCR estimates that by the end of 2024, more than 100 million people around the world will be forcibly displaced due to the persecution, armed conflict, human rights violations, and also environmental factors such as the increasing frequency and severity of natural disasters. The increasingly complex causes and the consequence of displacement pose a series of threats to people's lives, livelihoods, and dignity. Forced migration is a concern to human security, which JICA upholds in its mission. Conventionally, humanitarian actors have played a central role in responding to forced migration crises. In response to today's evolving landscape of these challenges, humanitarian actors are providing assistance to diverse populations and adapting to different forced migration scenarios globally. Moreover, these efforts underscore the importance of humanitarian development of peace nexus, so-called HDP nexus, which requires cooperation across humanitarian and development boundaries. As Japan's Development Cooperation Agency, JICA is also committed to promoting the HDP nexus to respond to forced displacement crisis in cooperation with humanitarian agencies and peace actors to achieve human security for all. In this context, the Peacebuilding and Humanitarian Support Cluster at the JICA Ogata Research Institute has conducted a research project Evolving Humanitarian Action for Forced Migration since 2022. Today's seminar inaugurates the publication of the book, Forced Migration and Humanitarian Action, Operational Challenges and Solutions for People on the Move, which is an outcome of the research project. This book offers thought-provoking insights into different scenarios of forced migration. By examining different humanitarian responses to children, women, people with disabilities, the elderly, and trafficked migrant workers, the book brings together experiences and knowledge of the strength and weakness of the humanitarian system in responding effectively to the specific and different needs of displaced people. It is hoped that its findings will be translated into more effective humanitarian action. We are always striving to bridge the gap between research and practice. To this extent, I would like to introduce another outcome of the research project. Guidance Note, Humanitarian Action for Different at-Risk Groups in Displacement. Published in April last year, this guidance note summarizes the findings of 5 case studies included in the book. It provides practitioners and organizations with details of operational challenges and possible solutions in the area of participation, coordination, data, and service delivery based on the findings produced by the project. Beyond the case studies, this guide may be relevant to other vulnerable populations in displacement. In this seminar, the editors and contributors will present the contents of the book, together with the JICA practitioners as discussant and the audience. We will deepen the understanding of the evolving challenges in dealing with different and diverse populations in forced migration. I really look forward to a healthy and lively discussion with you all. Thank you very much.
Orita, thank you for your opening remarks. So we will now move on to the presentation session. And before that, I'd like to introduce today's panelists and commentators. Would all the panelists and commentators turn on your camera to introduce you to the audience? Thank you. Oh, there are many. So, first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lorenzo Guadagno. He is the project coordinator, platform on disaster displacement, and he is a co-editor of the book. Second, I would like to introduce Dr. Irene Schöfberger and Ms. Salma Nooh. They have contributed to the chapter on child migration as the former data and research officers of Global Migration Data Analysis Center, the International Organization for Migration. Dr. Schöfberger now works at the Research Center of the German Federal Office for Migration and Refugees, and Ms. Nooh is at the Center for Environment and Development for the Arab region and Europe. Next panelists from International Organization for Migration, Displacement Tracking Metrics, Ms. Nikki Herwanger, Unit Head of Displacement Tracking Metrics, and Ms. Alexandra Bates, Program Support Officer. They have contributed to the chapter on women's participation in humanitarian data collection. Next, Mr. Oliver Viegas from Christian Blind Mission and Ms. Louisa Yasukawa, the former staff of the International Displacement Monitoring Center and now at the Refugee Advice and Casework Service, who are the authors of the chapter on Disability Inclusive Humanitarian Action. Next, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lisette R. Robles, our visiting fellow of the JICA Ogata Research Institute. She is the co-editor of the book and the co-author of the chapter on inclusion of displaced older people. Next, Mr. Kaito Takeuchi, a research fellow of JICA Ogata Research Institute. He is the co-author of the chapter on forced migrant workers. We also have a distinguished commentator. I'd like to introduce Ms. Ayako Oi, Senior Director, Head Office for Governance and Peacebuilding. She has a lot of field experience in conflict-affected countries. So let's start the presentations. Should the panelists and commentator, except Dr. Guadagno, turn off your camera? Thank you. So, Dr. Guadagno, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Dr. Muto. Thank you, Dr. Orita, for the welcoming words. As the co-editor of the book, I have the privilege of reading all the chapters multiple times, and so I'm quite familiar with all the content, and I've been also tried to draw together a few of the common lessons from these different chapters. And I will focus a little bit on an introduction to the book and perhaps and flagging some of these points that are coming more clearly from all the contributions. So first of all, as has been already highlighted by Ms. Orita, and if we can go to the next slide, please. The reason why we have focused on this specific topic for this book is because of the centrality that forced population movements have in defining what the crisis is, how it happens, and then how humanitarian assistance really needs to be provided. We don't need to look further than any newspaper recently, right, to have instances of how crises result in massive population movement. If you look at the situation in Ukraine, where some 4 million people are internally displaced and 7 million are refugees across borders. You look at Gaza, right, where there are 2 million people that are internally displaced. It's something like 90% plus of the population is internally displaced. That's in addition to decades of internal displacement, of movements across borders, etc. Or you look at Los Angeles, the fires, right, that in a couple of days have basically displaced tens of thousands of people. So this displacement, these movements are a defining feature of crisis. They define where people are, where they need to be assisted, what type of risks they are facing, what type of needs they had, and therefore shape the ways in which humanitarian actors need to operate, right? There are other situations that this book also considers, the situations in which migrants are forced into more constrained spaces of choice, of freedom, of deciding where they can go, where they can actually move, how they can move, because of political choices regarding borders. And those are situations in which migration itself becomes a crisis because migrants are faced with risks and needs that become a trigger for humanitarian interventions in many cases. So we are looking at these different contexts, but all of them are characterized by this restricted space for freedom of choice, for agency on the part of people that are moving, right? And therefore of heightened situations of risks and needs. And this is really the core of what humanitarian actors end up addressing in these situations. How do we make sure that people get the levels of assistance and protection that they deserve? So I think the other feature that we're looking at when we're looking at these situations is that this crisis, these migration situations in crisis, they really define how long a crisis lasts. They are open-ended in a way. They're not like an earthquake that happens and then it's over. They're not like a flood, they're not like a fire. Even a conflict ends, but after the acute phases of a crisis end, the need for humanitarian assistance continues as long as people are in situation of displacement. And therefore, in a way, as long as these situations are not addressed, we cannot really say that crises are over, right? And that requires humanitarian actors to be able to keep continuing providing services for longer periods. If you think about, for instance, Gaza now or Syria, people are coming back, but people that are coming back will still need assistance to be able to find solutions in the places, even when they are coming from, right? So there is this element that I think then fits really interestingly with the human security element that has been highlighted, that is really at the core of JICA's mandate, and that in particular, I think fits perfectly then considering where the origins, right, of this specific research institute and the work that has been done by Madame Ogata with refugees, with internally displaced persons. Next slide, please. The other key concept that we're using to define the scope of this book really is the concept of vulnerability. None of these crises, can we have the next, sorry, this is it, sorry. None of these crises really affect everyone in the same manner, right? People are affected in different manners by the same event. And this is because of their intrinsic vulnerability, right? Vulnerability, and I mean intrinsic because it's predetermined by factors that are preceding a crisis. They are not due to their necessarily to their situation when the crisis happens. And I think we're using vulnerability, which is a concept that's been criticized in the humanitarian space, as a way to understand the situation of people and to understand how humanitarians can operate in a more effective manner. And in this type of forced migration scenarios, vulnerability translates in different patterns of movements, in different risks and needs, in different needs for assistance, and also in different ways in which people are able to recover, to find solutions, to go back to normalcy, let's say. But all these conditions of vulnerability, they are really linked with structural factors of the context in which people are living. So we are looking at groups, we are looking at different groups that have different needs for specific forms of assistance, but really we are also looking at social, political, economic factors that make those groups particularly vulnerable in crisis. So this is not about innate conditions of people, it's about how systems work, right? How the development conditions in certain places actually take place and shape these sources of vulnerability. Next slide, please. So we're looking at this. We have decided to focus on different forced migration contexts, different crisis contexts, different types of groups that can be affected by this crisis. And Orita-san has already highlighted which ones these are, as well as different forms of humanitarian action, different responses, right? And so throughout this chapter, we are looking a little bit at how these different forms of humanitarian assistance can be adapted in different contexts to cater for the specific needs of different people. And this is a little bit scattered in terms of the approach. It's not necessarily comprehensive. We also know that it's not just these groups that are particularly vulnerable in crisis, right? You could make a case for the inclusion of marginalized ethnic minorities, for LGBTQI prisoners, all sorts of other identities that might end up facing situations of particular needs. But these are the ones that the book covers. And I think throughout the work of this group of authors that are primarily practitioners, actually, there are a few lessons that really come strongly to the evidence of that this book is bringing, and that are captured also in this guidance note that has just been mentioned. Next slide. And I would like to focus primarily on 3 points. So first of all, that we really need to be able to deliver adapted humanitarian assistance in different contexts and to different people. And this really means, on one side, adapting the way traditional humanitarian services like sheltering, distribution of food and non-food items, protection are provided, and making sure that they really cater for the specific needs of different people. And you will see the chapter that Oliver and Louisa are going to present speaks about accessibility. And for instance, that's a key concept. Lisette chapter speaks about how assistance can be adapted to the needs of older displaced persons. But it also means that we need to provide additional services that are perhaps a little bit outside the traditional humanitarian space. And I think the chapter that Kaito is presenting really speaks to that in operations that affect migrants, we need to think about nationality verifications. We need to think about cooperation with consular services. We need to think about repatriation. And those are things that perhaps are a little bit beyond the scope of traditional life-saving assistance in crisis for humanitarians. The second element, I think, that comes strongly across all these different chapters is the need for coordination and engagement of a broad sector, of a broad group of actors across sectors. So it's about engaging with governments of countries of origin, with humanitarian actors across different migration routes and in different places, private sector actor, as well as members of the communities that we're really targeting. And there are excellent examples of this. There are large regional coordination systems, for instance, in the chapter that Irene and Salma have been writing on data sharing. Again, Kaito's chapter on collaboration with countries of origin and destination, that's another excellent example of this. But this collaboration is really essential for delivering targeted services, for having access to communities that are often invisible, to having information. And ultimately, another lesson that comes out, I think, is that these systems needs to be set up way before the crisis, ideally, and they need to be set up as part of preparedness. And they need to include, again, people from these communities, right? However, because they include actors that are typically outside the humanitarian coordination space, they also need to include ways to capacitate, to build awareness, to bring these people into systems to collaborate. And the last, I think, reflection that comes up is how a lot of this work challenges the traditional boundaries of humanitarian action, really. To what extent is advocacy, specific forms of fundraising, specific interventions that challenge, for instance, gender roles, like in the chapter Nikki and Alexandra are presenting, are part of humanitarian action? And to what extent these forms of humanitarian action can either challenge or reproduce ways in which these forms of vulnerability are really created in different societies. So I think as we're thinking about, in particular, this last point, in a period in which inclusion, equity become, to some extent, politically sensitive topics, and in which more broadly humanitarian assistance is politicized, is really the subject of political tensions, and these are important reflections that go really beyond the scope of this project and that perhaps can inform further works and reflection more broadly. So thank you for your attention. Thanks to everyone for the organization of this seminar. And thank you to all the authors for the collaboration throughout the project.
Dr. Guadagno, thank you very much for your overall and comprehensive introduction of the book. So now, please turn off your camera. And also now, we will move on to our next presentation. Dr. Schöfberger and Ms. Nooh, would you turn on your camera, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Salma Nooh, and together with my colleague, Dr. Irene Schöfberger, we are glad to present our chapter, which we worked on during our previous roles at IOM's Global Migration Data Analysis Center in Berlin, titled Humanitarian Programming on Child Migration in Northern Africa and Southern Europe, the Role of Data. Next slide, please. This is the plan of the presentation. First, I will provide an overview of child migration and their humanitarian concerns. Then I will highlight the main challenges related to the use of child migration data for humanitarian programming. After that, I will present some ongoing initiatives and good practices on the use of child migration data for humanitarian settings. And finally, I will give the floor to Irene to present the case study. Next slide, please. In 2020, international child migrants were estimated to be around 35.5 million globally, and this is the highest number that has ever been recorded. As the number of child migrants continues to rise globally, the humanitarian needs of these migrant groups are also growing, but are often overlooked. And it's important to remember that behind each number is a child with a unique migration experience and different challenges. Non-state humanitarian actors play a key role in addressing these challenges and in meeting the needs of child migrants, especially when state support falls short. However, non-state humanitarian actors need timely and comprehensive data to identify the needs of the beneficiaries, design tailored assistance programs, raise funds, and advocate for the legitimacy of their interventions. But unfortunately, there are challenges related to child migration data that limit the response of non-state humanitarian actors. This is why in our chapter, we focus on how non-state humanitarian actors use the data and evidence on child migrants for humanitarian programming in Northern Africa and Southern Europe. And we focused on Northern Africa and Southern Europe as crossing the Mediterranean to reach Europe is by far the deadliest migration route worldwide. Next slide, please. The main challenges related to child migration data include the lack of timely and comprehensive data collection, as for example, censuses, which are one of the main migration data sources, are conducted every 10 years, and sometimes even further delayed, so the data tend to be outdated. Moreover, the disaggregation of migration data by age and sex tends to be scarce. And there is also limited integration of the different sources and systems and limited data sharing and dissemination. Other than that, collecting data on child migrants tends to be difficult because it's often challenging to access this population group. And sometimes child migrants may avoid contact with data collectors for many reasons, including their age and their legal status. Another main challenge is that countries often adopt different data collection methodologies and concepts and definitions. So this affects cross-country data sharing and data comparability. And finally, so far, the research on the use of child migration data for humanitarian programming is limited. So all these challenges affect the support that non-state humanitarian actors could provide to child migrants. But to address these challenges, some good practices and initiatives have emerged. And one key initiative is the International Data Alliance for Children on the Move, known as the IDAC. The IDAC is a global coalition that was established in 2020 by IOM, UNICEF, UNHCR, OECD, and Eurostat to improve the data and statistics on child migrants and support evidence-based policymaking. Other than that, UNICEF developed guidelines for ethical research involving children. IOM started including children aged 14 to 17 years old in some flow monitoring surveys, and IOM's displacement tracking matrix developed the needs identification and analysis framework, which combines various sources as proxy indicators to assess factors that could increase the risks for children in an emergency. Next slide, please. Now over to you, Irene, to present the case study.
Thank you, Salma. In order to better understand these topics, we decided to conduct a case study on data on child migration and humanitarian programming in Northern Africa and Southern Europe. As you can see in the next slide, we conducted this study based on a mixed methods approach involving a literature review, policy analysis, and analysis of the website of different humanitarian actors working on child migration in these two regions, and 9 qualitative semi-structured interviews that we conducted with non-state humanitarian actors working in these regions, as well as with persons working with international organizations on the production of child migration data. In the next slide, we can see that we collected insights in 4 main areas. First, interviewees pointed at the different factors that contribute to the humanitarian needs of child migrants. These factors range from being outside of their normal social environments and community to other aspects such as more difficult access to education, healthcare, and income. Unaccompanied child migrants and others, such as those having an irregular migrant status, often experience a higher degree of vulnerability. Another important aspect that all interviewees underlined is the fact that, however, they consider that they do currently not have enough data and information on child migration and the related humanitarian needs. Aspects on which they would like to have more data and information include aspects such as humanitarian needs, but also how these are geographically distributed, what are the coping mechanisms that child migrants may have and that they may want to support, prefer communication channels, and this is particularly true for those groups that are hidden. Data producers identify different challenges with regard to data collection on child migrants in humanitarian settings. These include a scarce disaggregation by age and sex, but also the fact that data are often not shared across countries and among different actors. Related data collection procedures tend to be lengthy and costly, and it is often difficult to ensure funding for this data collection exercises, particularly in the long term. However, the persons we spoke with identified different good practices, such as combining macro-level data collected by international organizations with data that are collected on a local level. They also found the use of proxy indicators very useful, and they suggested that there is a potential in operational data that could be leveraged to complement insights from other data sources. In the next slide, you can see some conclusions of our chapter, and we found that data gaps do not hinder programming only. They also have an impact on other activities of non-state humanitarian actors, such as advocacy, public awareness initiatives, fundraising, and therefore these data gaps influence humanitarian assistance both directly and indirectly. Such gaps makes it difficult for all child migrants, but particularly for those that are the least visible to access humanitarian assistance, and this ends exacerbating their vulnerability. Such limited data availability hinders comprehensive and longitudinal analysis of child migration and of its link with other variables, and this makes it also difficult to develop longer-term assistance approaches. However, there is hope coming, for example, from initiatives such as the IDAC that Salma mentioned earlier, from the use of proxy indicators and other innovative methods, and from a potential use of operational data to improve programming and also delivering on humanitarian assistance for child migrants. Thank you.
Yes, yeah. Dr. Schöfberger and Ms. Nooh, thank you very much for your rich presentation. Please turn off your camera. So we now move on to our next presentation. Ms. Herwanger and Ms. Bate, please turn on your camera and the floor is yours.
Okay, we're back on the right track. So, as I was mentioning, data collection practitioners are custodians of an untapped expert understanding of the data collection process that can shed light on the impact of this process on data content and quality. Before we dive in to the presentation, we wanted to acknowledge, and we felt it was important to acknowledge, that this study was done in 2022 when the geopolitical and funding landscape for humanitarian action was very different. Despite this, our study and the findings of our study proposed some structural changes to our best practices for data collection. And we believe that these are relevant even in times of scarcity. So put simply, even when reduction in operations may be needed, representativeness is still possible and should be a priority to ensure quality data and to ensure quality humanitarian response. So we'll start by giving a very quick overview of what the displacement tracking matrix is, as it's the focus of our study. Essentially, it's IOM's primary data collection program that collects information on populations on the move to inform humanitarian and development responses. Next slide, please. The main methodology of focus is one that is not only implemented by IOM's DTM, but is in fact implemented sector-wide. In DTM, we call it the mobility tracking methodology. Essentially, it quantifies the presence of population categories of interest, of reasons for displacement, of length of displacement, and humanitarian needs within specifically defined geographical areas and locations. Next slide, please.
So our main research question is, how is humanitarian data content, quality, and accuracy impacted if there is a lack of equal representation of men and women among the enumerators? So that would be the data collectors Nikki was just mentioning, and then also the key informants, so the individuals that we would engage to obtain data. The 5 case study countries we selected were Haiti, Lebanon, South Sudan, Sudan, and Ethiopia. And the main 3 sub-questions of our study look at A, the common challenges or structural barriers to representativeness among those 2 groups. Number 2, the practices that the country teams had identified to overcome these obstacles. And then thirdly, the recommendations for data collection practices to be more representative going forward. Next slide, please. So for our literature review, I think thank you. So the main gap that we identified in the research was that there was not a lot of information on how female participation impacts data collection in forced displacement contexts. So we reviewed the 3 main bodies of literature we reviewed, where firstly, humanitarian action, forced migration, and its gender impacts, where most just requested more representative data. Next one, please. Secondly, the gender of enumerator effect, essentially social sciences studies looking at how the person who's asking the question impacts what data you're able to collect. And third one, please. The biases and data for humanitarian planning, going back to our original sector. And then finally, the research gap we aim to contribute to is how to collect more representative data and what factors from the operational perspective are barriers to this. Next slide, please.
On this slide, you can see the methodology that we pursued in our study. So as Alexandra mentioned, there were 5 case study countries selected. And with these 5 countries, we applied semi-structured interviews with data collection staff on the ground. We conducted 37 interviews in total and used a mixture of inductive and deductive thematic coding to analyze the qualitative data set. Next slide, please. Our first set of findings are on the common challenges and root causes, as well as structural barriers to the identification and recruitment of female enumerators across the case study countries. We had 2 cross-cutting areas of findings. The first was in relation to access to information about vacancies. We found that this was not equal between men and women, and that social networks played a large role in finding out about vacancy opportunities. Especially in teams where there was already a gender imbalance, it was difficult for this information to reach women by word of mouth, as the networks were largely male. Access to information through internet and public spaces was also not equal. In terms of recruitment barriers, we found quite interestingly that these were extremely diverse, and many of them defied cross-cutting classification. This suggests that what is necessary is extensive mapping per recruitment cycle in each country context to identify these barriers as and when they occur. The cross-cutting barriers that we did find in this area of our findings was that there were challenges related to the nature of the job. Enumerators face difficult working conditions. They are required to travel long distances and often exposed to personal risk. And these were incompatible with traditional female roles as primary caregivers. We also found that candidate profiles and availability were an issue in terms of educational levels and language proficiency, for example. But what is not on this slide and what is important to note is that our chapter also covers the tactics that teams on the ground are currently using to overcome these barriers. So I encourage you to have a look at that. Next slide, please.
So in terms of the structural barriers to engaging female key informants, in terms of the process, it's usually key stakeholders in the identification of key informants include DTM operations teams, the enumerators themselves, government, local authorities, and occasionally leaders from the community. Now, across all the countries, we found that these were disproportionately male roles, and this had a very big effect on onboarding of female key informants. Next slide, please. However, in our research, we were also surprised to find that it actually also goes beyond gender, and it's not necessarily always the most important factor that affects having representative data. So, for example, even challenges identifying objective key informants or key informants that were hard to find for certain population groups were features of this. One other example was that social hierarchy still dominated. So even in countries where you would have 50-50 male and female participating in a focus group discussion, one country team mentioned that it was often the older females who were speaking on behalf of everybody else. Next slide, please.
So our interviewees, without being prompted, overwhelmingly stated that the data that they collected in terms of content quality and accuracy is impacted if there's an imbalance in gender in enumeration teams and in key informants. These were across two dimensions. Firstly, operational feasibility. So access was easier when teams were gender balanced. Cooperation of communities was also increased when teams were gender balanced. And content and quality is the second area. So due to different spheres of knowledge between and across genders, there was a varying capacity to collect accurate data in areas like food security, which is not traditionally considered a gendered area of indicators. Next slide, please.
So finally, to come to conclusions, recommendations. So our chapter very in detail lists out the different recommendations that were given. But for this slide, we wanted to summarize some of the themes that came through in the main conclusions. So firstly, addressing the challenges and barriers for achieving higher gender parity in the enumeration teams and for the key informants is a highly context-specific endeavor and should continue to be decided at the country level in terms of operational feasibility. Number two, it requires a multi-pronged approach as balance in both groups, the enumerators and the key informants, are related to each other, but they're also shaped by their own unique external factors. So finally, our main conclusion is the fact that a dedication of appropriate resources and time for country teams to identify these obstacles at the most granular possible level is very important to understand what impedes growing gender parity across the enumerator teams and key informants, and finally, that it is a fundamental first step.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Herwanger and Ms. Bates, for your rich presentation. So now we move on to the next presentation. Mr. Vigas and Ms. Yasukawa, please turn on your camera and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And now moving to our case study on what is faster than us speaking. On person with disabilities in internal displacement, where we look into the case of Vanuatu in Nigeria. It's my colleague Louisa and me. And maybe just as a starting point, in this year 2025, at just a very rough calculation, there is about 48 million people with disabilities in need of humanitarian action, which of course also includes a lot of people with disabilities in situations of internal displacement. So just to give you a rough idea on the number of people that we talk about here. And then we can now move to the next slide. And the starting point for Lisa and me was a bit when we look at the global level, what we have in terms of policies, specifically internationally, we have the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. This almost 20 years. We have the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is very inclusive. We also have since 2019 the Inter-Agency Standing Committee guidelines on the inclusion of people with disabilities in humanitarian action. So all these wonderful, nice documents at a very high level. But how much does this really trickle down? Think about a person with disability, someone with a visual impairment sitting somewhere in a camp of internal displaced people. What does he or she really kind of get out of these wonderful documents in terms of concrete humanitarian support from UN agencies or NGOs? So this was our question, our starting point. To what extent is the very positive policy commitments that we see implemented in practice? Now we can move to the next slide. And as a starting point to also frame our research, we use the IHC guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action because they provide a very nice framework. They have these kind of 4 must-do actions, or you can see there's four common themes, which help a bit to structure our analysis. We will come to this and also our findings. So one of the very first one is, of course, the meaningful participation of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. There is a lot of talking about removal of different types of barriers, which is a very important concept. We also talk about capacity building for humanitarian stakeholders, but also of organization of persons with disabilities, and data disaggregation. We already had a lot of data. It's also very important for disability inclusion, because only if you count persons with disabilities in a humanitarian crisis, you will know the prevalence and you will know what the specific needs are. Quickly about the methodology for our case study, which is on the next slide. As we already said, we looked into 2 different contexts. One is Vanuatu, where Louisa was focusing on, and I was looking more into Nigeria. We agreed to have these 2 different contexts because Vanuatu is more linked to natural disasters. Very often we have cyclones there. While in Nigeria, when we look into the northeast, it's very much along conflict. It's very much conflict-driven displacement. So it's 2 different contexts. And we wanted to see if there's also common patterns or differences in terms of internal displacement. We started, of course, with a desk review of humanitarian response plans, of policies at country level, of reports from various humanitarian actors working in these crises, and documentations from various resources. And then we also conducted, as most of the other researchers here, key informant interviews in 222 and 223 to also get a bit more the practical and in-person insights. And now Lisa can continue with Vanuatu.
Thank you, Oliver. Next slide, please. So Vanuatu is one of the countries with the highest disaster risk worldwide. And we decided to compare the responses across 3 different disasters that have resulted in mass displacement in Vanuatu. And they were Tropical Cyclone Pam in 2015, the Ambai volcanic eruptions in 2017 and 2018, and Tropical Cyclone Harold in 2020. Now, existing research conducted after Tropical Cyclone Pam demonstrated the significant challenges experienced by persons with disabilities. So there were reports that they were separated from their assisted devices when evacuating from the cyclone, and that many faced barriers accessing information about what to do in the emergency and accessing evacuation centers. Following Tropical Cyclone Pam, Vanuatu introduced new policies and guidelines which called for more inclusive humanitarian action so that the same barriers would not continue to be experienced by persons with disabilities. And our research demonstrated that there has been significant progress in terms of inclusion at all phases of humanitarian action. And this was evidenced in the response to Tropical Cyclone Harold. So here we can see a diagram which highlights some of the positive changes that were brought to light through our research. So for instance, shortly before Tropical Cyclone Harold, accessible evacuation points were shared with residents. There was also greater effort to collect disability disaggregated data, which was used to inform distribution points and service assistance. The National Organization of Persons with Disability also played a key role, and representative of the organization attended all cluster meetings, and the first disability subcluster was established. Key informants did note, however, that there are still ongoing challenges, which we'll discuss in the conclusions. One of them was that although people with disabilities have a seat at the table and are now joining the meeting, they question whether their participation was really meaningful and goes far enough. Another takeaway was that given the frequency of disasters, key informants noted that there's often insufficient time to mainstream disability inclusion, highlighting the need for greater inclusive preparedness and anticipatory action. Oliver, over to you.
So next slide, we are jumping a bit geographically from Vanuatu to Nigeria. Next slide, please. So just a very quick snapshot about the overall policy framework in Nigeria and the overall humanitarian situation. So we have in Nigeria a national IDP policy from the government already in place since more than 10 years. We also have the ratification of the UN CRPD. So also in terms of disability inclusion, actually from the policy level, it should be there. When we look more at the institutional framework, when it comes to the more concrete humanitarian work in the northeast of the country, so we have since many years a humanitarian response plan, and now since this year it's a humanitarian needs and response plan in place. We have also a very strong humanitarian coordination system in place, which is also very important for disability inclusion. We will come to this. Very much, of course, external humanitarian funding from the various donor agencies. And as we already mentioned, UN agencies and many NGOs working in this humanitarian crisis, as we already said, for many years, many of them already. And just to give you another nice, or not so nice figure, but we talk about roughly 4.4 million people impacted in only 3 states in 2024 by the humanitarian crisis. So only in this country, 4.4 million people affected. But let's come more to the disability inclusion side, which is reflected on the next slide in 2 nice graphics, because this is what we are interested about. So how does disability inclusion evolved over the last years when it comes to the humanitarian side? And here we have 2 nice graphics. Let me start with the one on the left side. This is an analysis of the humanitarian response plans and to which extent we find the word disability or person with disabilities in the humanitarian response plans, which is already giving us a very good indication because the humanitarian response plans are developed by the humanitarian actors working in this crisis. And the more we find a word inside these humanitarian response plans, the more we can also assume that a certain topic is of relevance. And we can see that the number of occurrences of the word disability or disabilities has increased over the years, which is already a very good sign that there is at least more awareness for the topic and more planning. And then when we look at the right side, this is showing the number of person with disabilities addressed by the Nigerian Humanitarian Fund. So there's a country-based pool fund under the lead of UN OCHA, specifically for Nigeria. And we also see that through this funding that comes every year, again, the number of person with disabilities that have been addressed is increasing, which is another good sign in terms of disability inclusion, especially as we see that in 2018 there was nothing, which could also mean that there was no data because they have not collected any data. It was not disaggregated. Next slide, please. So when we look into Nigeria, just a very few conclusions, we see that in general, certain progress has taken place. When we look at the period between 2018 and 2023, we see also that a lot of organizations, humanitarian organizations, are nowadays better sensitized than it was like 7 years ago now. When it comes to disability inclusion, and many organizations have also started with some at least basic activities to better mainstream disability inclusion in their core activities. And because of the time, we would now skip the next 2 slides and come to the very last slide that we have. One more.
Great. So we've already mentioned them, but a few key conclusions. Firstly, regarding data collection, there was a strong emphasis on collecting quantitative data, but our research highlighted the need for better qualitative data. And that's also important to highlight intersectional risks and challenges that people with disabilities face. We know that people with disabilities are not a homogeneous group, so qualitative data can assist in better understanding how women or children or people from different socioeconomic backgrounds or with different types of disabilities are affected in different ways. And finally, we also noticed the need for greater emphasis on addressing attitudinal barriers to try to address the social stigma associated with people with disabilities in a humanitarian setting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vegas and Ms. Yasukawa, for your informative presentation. Please turn off your cameras. And now we will move on to the next presentation. Now, Dr. Robles, would you turn on your camera? And the floor is yours.
Thank you. On behalf of my colleague, Dr. Rogie Royce-Carandang, who is a co-author of my chapter. I'll be presenting today our chapter on displaced older people. So we'll wait for the slides. Okay, so our chapter is entitled Inclusion of Displaced Older People in Research and Practice, Insights on Humanitarian Action for Older Filipinos. So can you move to the next slide, please? One more. Another one. Okay, so oftentimes when we start to talk about displacement, we'll usually see this graph that tells us about the composition of the people who are displaced, the type of population based on the UN HCR's trends in terms of people who are internally displaced, refugees, those under the in need of international protection, etc. However, I want us to look at another graph, which is the next slide. So for this one, let's look at the graph for people in displacement, but this time in terms of their demographic composition, male and female. And I'd like us to focus on the one on the left side, which is in terms of age. So as we can see, the population of people above 60 among those who are forcibly displaced is relatively small compared to those between 0 to 59 years old. However, the reason we decided to focus on this particular population for our case study is that eventually this population from 0 to 59 there's no other direction but will go up to that range from 60 and above. And as we have observed more recently, a lot of cases of displacement now had been a lot more protracted, and it means to say a lot more people will be growing older in displacement. Next slide, please. So age is a significant marker of wisdom. We attribute a certain level of respect based on age. However, it also is a note for people's insecurity that with people's age comes a certain level of vulnerability related to their advanced age. And during crises and emergencies, the evidence of older people's inadvertent invisibility in crisis response and recovery becomes more pronounced. There are multiple aspects of protection and interventions and service provisions that are lacking in terms of ensuring that everyone is actually being included. And perhaps it's those who are in the smaller proportion of older people are among those who are often left behind in this aspect. So the reports on humanitarian action that already emphasize the importance of ensuring the safety and security of the most vulnerable in humanitarian response. Despite the presence of instruments and policies, there's still a gap in implementing adequate and targeted support that still needed to be expanded. Next slide, please. So the recognition of the fundamental obligation to provide comprehensive assistance for older people exists, but the challenge is actually identifying the how humanitarian actions should be adapted to ensure that their needs are actually adequately met. And that's why for our case study, we focus on the question of what characterizes humanitarian action for displaced older people in its presence in research and practice. So we want to examine the features of humanitarian action for displaced older people as elaborated in existing documents, academic studies, and observe in practical implementation, and reflects on the outstanding gaps and fulfilling more comprehensive support for those for this particular vulnerable group. So for our particular chapter, we focus on the case of humanitarian action for older Filipinos. At present, Filipinos are basically among those in the younger age group. However, in the coming, as reported by 2030, along with Cambodia, Mongolia, and Timor-Leste in East Asia, Philippines will also be among those whose number of older people will actually increase. So although the percentage is small, the actual number in comparison to the total population is relatively big. And that's why we thought that it would be beneficial to actually understand and assess sooner on how this particular at-risk groups can be addressed during crises and emergencies. Next slide, please. So let's start first with looking at this connection between aging, displacement, and global policies. Next slide. So forward, please. One more. Okay, so there's a lot of terms to refer to older people. You have elderly, senior, older adults, and older people. So it's actually a person's age is descriptive of one's entitlements dictated by social norms, and regrettably also as a basis for discrimination. Age is predicated by chronological age, physical attributes, biological relationships, and social position. So the World Health Organization's report identified this, named this two conceptualization model. One is the deficit model, which identify old age as a period of vulnerability. Likewise, it's also a period for value of social engagement, wherein the contribution of older people in the society is recognized. So ideally, these two approaches should be seen as a complementary element of what comprises old age. However, during crises, there's a lot more, it's a lot more leaning to this deficit model of seeing old age as a person that is of increased vulnerability, overlooking their value of social engagement. Next slide. So in terms of policies, as early as the 1970s, there's already a recognition of the need to understand the serious problem of aging. So you already have the UNGA Resolution 3352, and by 1983, you have the Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging, followed by the UN Principles for Older People. And the most significant document in aging is the 2002 Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, which recognizes the role of older people in development. In matters of protection during emergencies, the Vienna Plan of Action also have specific notes on the humanitarian and development aspects of aging. As well, for the Madrid Plan of Action, there's also the recognition of older people in emergencies, ensuring calling for equal access and recognition of their enhanced contributions, and also their inclusion in operational standards and coordination in humanitarian response present in the Sphere Handbook and also the IASC 2008. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay, so for us to understand more this presence of older people in terms of research and practice, we combined two methodologies, primarily scoping review and key informant interviews. In the next slide, you can see the flow diagram for our data collection for the scoping review. So we actually look into 7,500 documents, screening them to find which covers the topics of displacement, older people, and humanitarian action. And from there, we come up with, we identified 20, which is in the next slide. Yeah, this is the list of summaries of studies that actually covered those points. Later, I'll be sharing more details about this. Combining this more tedious, like review of academic papers, we actually combine this with key informant interviews, which is listed on the next slide. So these are interviews with actors engaged in working with older people, and whenever available, older people in displacement, and with a geographical focus on the Philippines. So all of those that we have interviewed are actually people who have been working with older people in the Philippines, coming from the academe, humanitarian actors, older people organization, local government unit, as well as national NGOs. So next slide. So combining those two, we come up with this key points in terms of discussing humanitarian action and the displaced older people. So from the scoping review, most of the studies that covers various types, it's cross-sectional, there are qualitative, mixed method, and case reports. Majority are case reports, and then countries and territories that were covered are quite varied, including the Philippines, which is the focus of, 1 minute to go. Okay, that's fast. Okay, so anyway, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so this one describes the displacement condition in the Philippines. Next slide, please. One more. Okay, so we noticed that for older people, there are a lot of concerns in terms of data. The absence of older people from data equates to their absence in terms of service provision. There's also this oversimplification of the needs of older people in for different segments of older people. Next slide. Okay, so for the humanitarian actors there who are engaged with working with older people, collaboration between designated government offices, national NGOs, and international humanitarian actors are very much needed. Next slide. In terms of meeting older people's needs, they definitely rely on formal assistance and services provided by aid agencies. And also, there are, similar to people with disability, barriers to accessing humanitarian services and recovery assistance is definitely needed. Next slide, please. Engagement. So there's a need to consider the active engagement or active participation among older people. What I wanted to emphasize here is that many older people need to receive care, but many are also serves as caregivers, which is very much important in looking at their positive contribution to their family, to their community, and society as a whole. Next slide. So I'll leave everything to you to actually read our chapter, because it's actually an interesting discussion on why that's also explaining why we're separating the case study on people with disability and also older people in displacement. Just on the concluding slide, please. Okay, so yeah, what we wanted to emphasize here is that older people's needs go beyond the initial phase of displacement. They need to be provided during the immediate response. However, they should also be provided, they need evolving support to improve their lives while in displacement. And also there's a need to recognize age-specific issues of older people and their changing roles, and also the need for visibility of older people, but their ability to access equitable and adequate assistance during crisis and displacement is very much. So yeah, thank you very much. Like I suggest, please read the chapter in full, and I think you'll understand it a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robles, for your informative presentation. Yes, please visit to the publisher's website, and the book is open access. So now we move to the next presentation. Mr. Takeuchi, please turn on your camera, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. With Dr. Tatsuya Hata, he's not present here today. He was previously professor of Hindai University in Osaka. Together with him, I contributed a chapter about the protection of forced migrant workers. In these years, the large international migration flows takes unsafe conditions for migrants and result in the increased risk of trafficking. The trafficking is an international crime, and it takes a form of modern slavery and significantly impacts basic human rights. Trafficking would be a risk for anyone, so anyone trafficking would be happen to everyone. But in particular, vulnerable groups like the global labor migrants are at risk. Trafficking of labor migrants makes their voluntary migration into forced migration. This is a particular case in Thailand, where Thailand's fishing industry receives international attention due to its issues with human trafficking. As you can see in the slide, there are large-scale rescue operations of trafficking fishermen in Indonesian territory and water between 2014 and 16. This is one of the largest counter-trafficking operations, saving more than 3,000 victims. This sensational case was widely reported by Associated Press, which won later the Pulitzer Prize too. A documentary film you can see on the left-hand side called Ghost Street was also made years later. Recently, a Japanese version was released too. When we were conducting our field research, NHK World was also covering the story. This trafficking also reveals seafood traceabilities, illegal and overfishing, also damaging the biodiversity. Interpreting this case in the context of business and human rights in these days, the issue is also attracting growing attention too. Through this case study, we discussed that the forced migrant workers are at risk inherently require humanitarian protection, and the challenge in that humanitarian offer the protection. Next slide, please. Just to quickly go through the literature review and the objective chapter. Past study highlights the counter-trafficking action from more like the legal and policy perspectives, rather limited focus on the life-saving approach. So we essentially have to examine that what counter actions are taken, also saving the trafficking migrant workers. It should be considered as the traffic migrants as a subset of forced migrants, as I described in the beginning. Having said that, the research aims to explore a question what are the needs and challenges of protecting traffic migrant workers. With this question, we attempted to draw out implications for wider trafficking situation and the forced migration scenarios and the key findings for the strengths and counter-trafficking efforts in general. Next slide. Just to touch upon the methodology, we combined the research approach, including literature review, in-depth interview, and field observations. Collected literature and in-depth interviews focus on the organization involved in rescue operations. Next slide. As for the analysis framework, we conceptualize counter-trafficking action from a humanitarian action perspective. By definition, humanitarian action involves saving lives, alleviate suffering, and also saving human dignity. In counter-trafficking action, IOM considers the counter-trafficking serves as life-saving activities. So humanitarian action and the counter-trafficking action share commonality in terms of the life-saving approach. In particular, in anti-trafficking action, there is an international treaty called the Parent Protocol, which also criminalizes the trafficking, human trafficking. The protocol not only criminalizes it, but also provides a framework for counter-trafficking action, which adapts a criminal justice approach. Criminal approach including safeguards of victims' rights, providing assistance, and also pursuing traffickers. The protocol also indicates that partnership paradigms that promotes collaboration among stakeholders in the counter-trafficking action. To take that to four capital of peace, 4 P's of protection, 4 P's of prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership described as a concept of counter-trafficking action. Among which we took the protection and partnership relevant to humanitarian action. So this is the perspective we assess the counter-trafficking action into the force humanitarian action. Next slide, please. Just want to share the migration overview in Thailand. Migration in Thailand is very complex. Thailand has been a crossing point for human mobility in the region. Thailand received many migrants from Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. These three countries are called CM countries. In this region, people migrated by different reasons, like political, economic, environment, and even coercive reasons. This drives migration makes the boundary of regular and irregular migration blurred. This is evident by the migrants use both regular and illegal channels, which are prevalent and make it challenging to capture the totality of the regional migration. As for the figure, Thailand hosts more than 3.3 million registered migrants from CM countries, and more than half of them are from Myanmar. I would like to note that this figure does not include those unregistered migrants who tend to come to Thailand by irregular means. Besides that, we should also note that UNHCR identified 674,000 people of concern, including refugees and also status people. Next slide. In Thailand, trafficking in sexual exploitation has long been problematized. Trafficking also expands to the labor sector like agriculture, construction, and fisheries, which necessitates a comprehensive response nationwide. In combating the trafficking, NGOs play a critical role. And one of that, the case study we explored was the activity done by the Labor Rights Promotion Network, which is an NGO addressing the labor rights issues since 2004. They also cover the migrant issues too. In response, the Thai government established government agencies like DATIP and COMI to address the human trafficking issues. They also promote the inter-agency collaboration, including NGOs. Besides these national governments, also the domestic NGOs activity, I'd like to also mention that the international assistance or the regional assistance is there. One of such examples is like as regional assistance in enhancing coordination and for national and regional counter-trafficking action. Next slide, please. So now I would like to talk about the case study. The NGO, like I mentioned, LPN, discovered that there was a significant number of missing fishermen stranded in islands of Indonesia. with the media footage, the Thai government NGO started to respond to the trafficking in the Indonesian territories and waters in large scale. In total, 3,413 people rescued between the 2 years of 2014 and 2016. Other than Thai national, mostly from Myanmar, and the children were included. Because of different migration pattern and trafficking exposure, their needs for protection were differentiated. To understand needs, first thing is that to identify who they are and where they come from. But this is quite difficult things to begin with, because most of them are undocumented people, so there is no means to identify which their nationalities are. And also in this context, it is identified that some of them are stateless, and this also reflects the complex situation of Thai migration, which is also including the stateless people. Next slide, please. When counter trafficking protection, there are 4 types of activities. The first is to rescue and identify a trafficked person. Trafficking is often described as hidden in plain sight, meaning it is difficult to find. So to unveil the hidden population, the tremendous efforts are needed. Grassroots network was also quite utilized. NGOs like NPN receive consultations from families and fishing, missing their fishermen, and they through such a network, they start discovering where their stranded people are. Shelter and recovery is an essential part of the provision of the assistance. And since their needs were diversified, many agencies have to made a partnership to cover a wide range of the assistance. Safe return and repatriation should be done after the shelter, but the means of their return and repatriation was varied by nationality. And after the repatriation, reintegration and rehabilitation assistance was provided, but it was quite limited, I have to note, and also varied by the country. Next slide, please. And on the partnership side, there's also many organizations involved in a different stage, so it's not very easy to make bigger coordination efforts. Many of our interviews highlighted the lack of robust coordination mechanism was quite challenging to make a coordinated effort. Next slide, please. So from the case study, there are a few points that we want to highlight. The first is that the evident counter-trafficking measure against fishermen through forced displacement interview humanitarian action in terms of life-saving and in short term, but it also requires a long-term intervention like development approach. Second, that it also needs the capacity building to effectively respond to such case that they eventually discover. Thirdly, the involvement of migrant workers or those rescued trafficked fishermen played a vital role in search and rescue operation. Next slide, please. At last, cross-border mobility of migrant workers is complex. So it also described that the distinction between voluntary and forced migration becomes blurred. It's quite difficult to not only capture the situation or problem by just as a humanitarian action, but also the development concern. It has to be a combined perspective will be required. Lastly, to conclude, we identified achievement challenges and the counter trafficking for migrant workers. Besides that, we want to acknowledge that the both short-term and long-term assistance are needed. And to enhancing that assistance, more coordination and partnership mechanism it would be desired. Thank you very much. That's all for me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Takeuchi. Please turn off your camera. So now I think the audience can get the full understanding with a multiple layer of forced migration. Now we move on to the comment session after all presentation. I'd like to invite Ms. Oi for your comments. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ayako Oi, and thank you very much for this opportunity to respond to the findings of the research project from the development perspective. Next slide, please. So you've all seen the graph before, so I'm not going into details, but I just want to highlight here one thing, which is the forced displacement is increasing and protracted. According to the UNHCR, 66% of the refugees have been in exile for at least 5 consecutive years, and sometimes for 10 years, 20 years, and even more. So in most cases, displacement or migration is not a temporary thing, but it could continue for many, many years. And we, as JICA or any other aid agencies, donors, NGOs, or host countries, we all have to deal with this issue based on this understanding that it's not a short-term situation, but a long-term situation. Next slide, please. I would like to introduce very briefly how JICA approaches peace building and forced displacement. JICA has programs in 20 thematic areas, and peace building is one of them. However, peace building is a relatively new area for JICA compared to sectors such as health, education, or agriculture. So 10 years ago, there was very few programs which was considered peace building, including projects on forced displacement. But I should say, unfortunately, because of the increasing and protracted conflict and violence, we find that there is a greater role for a development organization like JICA to play in conflict-affected setting, and that we can bring in our experience, our knowledge from the development work around the world. Next, please. 2 key approaches that I would like to highlight in our peace building operation. One is a human security approach, combining protection, empowerment, and solidarity. And the second is HTP Nexus approach to ensure collaboration, coherence, complementarity between humanitarian development and peace actors, not only to address the immediate needs at the onset of the crisis, but also to support the long-term solutions and to address the root causes of displacement. And as Office for Peace Building in JICA, we work very closely with humanitarian organizations such as UNHCR, UNRWA in Palestine, and NGOs. And we have ongoing dialogue communication with various peace actors. Next, please. This is an overview of JICA's program on forced displacement, showing some examples of countries where JICA is involved. In forced displacement setting, we try to contribute to two aspects. One is inclusive and peaceful coexistence in host communities. So we support not only the forced displaced persons, but also the people in the host communities and the host countries. And the second is safe and voluntary return to their areas of origin. And we need to work on this more, I think, in order to resolve this issue on forced displacement. And we work in all of these programs utilizing JICA's experience as a development organization. For example, enhancing capacity building, respecting local context and the local ownership, and ensuring inclusion and sustainability. Next, please. So in relation to the research project and its findings, I would like to make a few comments. First of all the findings and perspectives, although they were discussed in humanitarian setting, I thought were relevant and agreeable from a development perspective. And in the interest of time, I'm only going to focus on one aspect, which is the engagement and the meaningful participation of the vulnerable groups, which I feel is essential for realizing human security. Next, please. The example that I would like to introduce to you is the work, our project for inclusive participatory planning at the refugee camps of the West Bank in Palestine. And when we started this project in 2016, the camps were set up and it has been there for more than 70 years, and the living conditions were deteriorating. And I wouldn't say there was none, but there was very limited opportunities for residents in the camps to have their voices heard and to participate in activities in the camps. So in cooperation with the Department of Refugee Affairs, DORA, we started this project to improve the living condition of refugee camps by developing a mechanism of participatory planning and implementation of what we called Camp Improvement Plan. There were two key approaches. One is the participatory planning process by including vulnerable groups and enabling them to take the initiative in identifying and solving the issues in the camps. And the second key approach was the capacity building of DORA so that they could take leadership and sustain the process after the project completion and also expand the system to camps outside the project target areas. Next, please. So this is the process of planning and implementation of the Camp Improvement Plan. And first is the talking part where through focus group discussions and a wider forum, the needs of vulnerable groups are identified and discussed by themselves. And then the planning part, based on the needs identified, there's a wider public consultation process and the plan with priority projects and activities is developed. And then the implementation part. The projects include, for example, infrastructure projects such as construction of youth centers or women's centers. And there were also non-infrastructure projects, for example, business skills training for women or recreational activities for people with disabilities or older people. And the impact, I think, was significant. And the process brought not only the improvement of living conditions in the camps, but there was often more communication, more mutual understanding amongst the residents. And also there were changes in people's behavior and motivation. For example, there was increasing confidence, knowing that your opinion matters and that you can make changes. And there were people finding a place or a connection within the community of the camp. And this, I believe, is really important for human security to have a dignified life wherever you are in humanitarian or development setting. Next, please. So as final comments, I want to reiterate the importance of meaningful participation for all the people, whether that's in development or humanitarian setting. However, I would also like to mention that meaningful participation requires a lot of time and resources. JICA's project in Palestine required a lot of preparation and investment for training in participatory planning process if you wanted to do that right. So this could be an operational challenge, especially for humanitarian actors in emergency situation. But I think there are ways to overcome this challenge. For example, JICA, we've always took this capacity building approach to counterparts so that the mechanism can be sustainable. And perhaps this is an area where we as JICA can contribute in cooperation with humanitarian and peace actors through HTP Nexus approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Oi, for your comprehensive intervention. Well, peacebuilding is about the conflict context, and our book covers not only the conflict context, but also the various humanitarian crises. But I hope we could get some interaction or the connection between the JICA's activities and also the content of the book. So now we'd like to move on to the Q&A session. Although the time of the end of the seminar is approaching, but we hope if we can get some question and answer. So would all the panelists turn your camera on, and also Ms. Oi, would you also turn on your camera? So first, we'd like to invite in-person participants for your questions and comments. Please kindly raise your hands, and when we acknowledge you, please state your name and affiliation before raising the questions. And also, if possible, please specify a panelist you'd like to address. You can ask questions in either English or Japanese. So if there's any question, please raise your hand.
I have small questions for Dr. Schöfberger and Ms. Nooh about the child migrants. There was a point about scarce harmonization of concept and definitions, and I was curious about that. So could you provide a specific example? And I'd like to ask also, like, why do you think those differences exist?
Thank you so much for your question. So what we meant by scarce harmonization of definitions is that sometimes countries adopt different definitions. Even the definition of a child itself is different, can be different between countries based on the age group. So this is one of the challenges that affect collecting data on child migrants specifically. I hope this answered your question, and Irene, if you'd like to add.
It means like it's just based on the cultures or like countries inside?
It's based on the data system itself.
That is okay. I got it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions?
My question is for Dr. Guadagno, right? Yeah, two interrelated questions. You began your excellent presentation by defining the concepts of crisis and vulnerability. Those are very important concepts. I also understand that the emphasis of the study is on the humanitarian action, which is critically important, particularly from the point of view of impacting policy. However, I am wondering whether the concept of forced migration too should have been defined, given it is a part of the main title of the book. The second related question is there a risk that the concept of forced migration could not accommodate an otherwise rich variety of people on the move which your study covers? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So perhaps I'll try to answer both of those together. First of all, the reason why I didn't go into specifics is because we only had 10 minutes, and I think I also already ran over those 10 minutes in my presentation. But we really meant to take a comprehensive approach to this situation. So including all situations in which people are forced to leave their homes because of risk to their lives, because of the impossibility to stay home without suffering consequences on their lives, on their physical integrity, on their availability of assets, etc. But also because we wanted to expand a little bit the definition and not only focus on displacement, to also capture situations like what Kaito was talking before, where you are a migrant that has moved because of economic reasons, and then because you're trafficked, your living conditions and security is vastly diminished all of a sudden. And then or maybe situations like the ones that Salma and Irene are describing, where you have flows of migrants through, for instance, Northern Africa in this case, that are moving for vastly different reasons, but that are all forced to move along those routes because of lack of alternatives. So this element of forced movement really is expressed as a limitation of freedom of choice. It's not necessarily in the trigger, it's more in the experience and in the trajectory of migration. So in order to flag that there are these differences, we try to take as broad a concept as possible, and therefore not think about displacement or refugee movements or movement of specific categories of people, but really try to take an all-encompassing term, and we chose forced migration because of that. But thanks for the question that allows us to explain a little bit where we're coming from.
Thank you very much. So if there is any question from the online participants, it's much appreciated. But at this moment, it seems that those still participants are preparing for their Q&A. So maybe the time is now approaching to the end. So we may take one last question. Or if all of the participants feel it's a good time, we can conclude the seminar. Okay.
My question is to Ayako Oi-san. How has JICA's efforts in Palestine, how has that changed since October 7? What did you do to empower the refugees then? How has the situation changed? I'd like to hear about that from you.
Thank you very much for that question. The current situation in Palestine is quite worrying. But as for the project that I mentioned, our support to the refugee camps in the West Bank has been continuing since then. However, the current situation in the West Bank is also very challenging, very tough, and the conditions are worsening. So it has been very difficult or not possible for example, the Japanese experts who work in the project to go to the West Bank and then actually work together with our counterparts. However, the project has been continuing because we already have partnership with the Department of Refugee Affairs, and they already have the tools. They know how to implement this process. So in that terms, the project has been ongoing. As JICA, there are assistance that has continued. There are things that we had to suspend because it was very difficult to travel. And we also had emergency assistance as well. And now we're observing the situation very closely, including our office, and see how the situation holds. And definitely we are discussing what can be done, what needs to be done in the future, in the short term and also in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we would like to conclude our book launch seminar. We would like to thank all the speakers and participants for joining us today. We believe that we had a very fruitful and nice session to get a deeper understanding about forced migration from multiple dimensions. So for those who wish to read or reread the book again, please visit our publisher's website. And again, I'd like to emphasize that our book is open access. So before closing the seminar, we would appreciate it if everyone in this seminar could provide your input by filling out our questionnaires. And so your feedback is important to us, so please take a moment to complete it. Once again, thank you very much for participating in this seminar, and we look forward to seeing you at another event, and have a nice evening.